The room was quiet save for the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor and the occasional rustle of fabric as Daniel shifted in his chair. He sat by his mother's bedside, his hands clasped tightly around hers, willing her to stay just a little longer. Eleanor had been his anchor through life, his confidant, his cheerleader, his safe haven. Now she lay frail and pale, her once vibrant eyes clouded with exhaustion. The doctors had warned him this moment was near, but nothing could prepare him for the hollow ache settling into his chest. Eleanor stirred faintly, her lips parting as if trying to speak. Daniel leaned closer, his heart pounding. "Mom?" he whispered, his voice cracking under the weight of emotion. Her gaze found his, and for a brief second, it felt like she was looking straight through time, seeing every memory they'd shared flash before her eyes. Then, with great effort, she raised a trembling hand to his cheek. "Daniel," she murmured, her voice barely audible over the hum of the machines. Tears welled up in his eyes as he nodded, urging her to go on. She took a shaky breath, her grip on his hand tightening ever so slightly. And then, in a tone so soft it almost blended with the silence, she whispered 4 words that would change everything. "Find your true father." The room seemed to freeze. Daniel blinked, certain he'd misheard. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what she'd said. True father? What did that even mean? He opened his mouth to ask, but before he could utter a word, Eleanor's hand slipped from his. Her eyes fluttered shut, and the steady beep of the monitor turned into one long, piercing tone. Nurses rushed in, their movements urgent, but Daniel barely registered them. All he could hear was the echo of those 4 words reverberating in his mind. For hours after they pronounced her gone, Daniel remained rooted to the spot, staring at the empty bed. The hospital staff eventually guided him out, offering condolences he couldn't fully process. As he walked to his car, the cold night air biting at his skin, he replayed the scene over and over in his head. Find your true father. Wasn't his father the man whose picture hung on the living room wall? The man who supposedly died in a car crash when Daniel was just 6 months old? Why would his mother say something like that now, in her final moments? By the time he reached home, exhaustion had set in, but sleep eluded him. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw his mother's face, heard her voice whispering those haunting words. Who was his true father, and why had she kept this secret buried for so long? The questions swirled endlessly, gnawing at him like an open wound. For the first time in his life, Daniel felt completely untethered, as though the foundation of everything he believed about himself had crumbled beneath his feet. As dawn broke, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Daniel made a silent vow. Whatever truth his mother wanted him to uncover, he would find it, even if it meant unraveling the very fabric of his existence. The days following Eleanor's passing were a blur of numbness and routine. Friends and family came to offer condolences, bringing casseroles and flowers that piled up on the kitchen counter. Daniel appreciated their kindness, but he couldn't bring himself to engage. His mind was consumed by one thing, the cryptic message his mother had left him. Find your true father. Those 4 words echoed in his thoughts like a riddle he couldn't solve. To distract himself, Daniel began sorting through Eleanor's belongings. It wasn't just about tidying up. It felt like a way to stay connected to her. He started with the living room, carefully packing away photo frames and trinkets she had cherished. But as he worked, he noticed something odd. There were hardly any pictures of his father. The few that existed showed a man with kind eyes and a warm smile, always standing slightly apart from Eleanor, as though unsure how to fit into the frame. Daniel paused, holding one of those photos closer to inspect it. Something about it didn't feel right. He remembered being told that his father died in a car accident when he was an infant. Yet, the details were hazy. Whenever he'd asked Eleanor about him as a child, she would quickly change the subject or give vague answers like, "He loved you very much," or "It's too painful to talk about." At the time, he hadn't questioned it. Now, though, doubt crept in. Why had she avoided talking about him? And why did these photos seem so staged? His search led him to the attic, a place untouched for years. Dust coated every surface, and the faint smell of old wood filled the air. As he rummaged through boxes labeled with faded handwriting, he found albums stuffed with yellowed photographs, letters tied with ribbon, and mementos from another era. One box caught his attention. It was smaller than the others, tucked away, in a corner as if meant to be forgotten. Inside, he discovered envelopes addressed to Eleanor, some postmarked decades ago. Curiosity got the better of him, and he opened one of the letters. The handwriting was neat but hurried, the ink smudged in places. The letter began with affectionate greetings, then shifted to hints of regret and longing. "I miss you more than words can say," it read. "But I know this is for the best. I hope one day you can forgive me." Daniel's heart skipped a beat. Who was this person? Was this the man Eleanor had been married to? If so, why did the tone sound more like a forbidden lover than a grieving spouse? As he sifted through the other letters, a pattern emerged. They spoke of stolen moments, secret meetings, and promises made under the cover of darkness. None of them mentioned Daniel directly, but the timeline suggested they were written around the time of his birth. A chill ran down his spine. Could it be possible that the man in the photographs, the one he thought was his father, wasn't his father at all? By the time he finished reading, the sun had dipped below the horizon, casting the attic in shadow. Daniel sat back, his mind reeling. The pieces didn't add up. If his mother had kept such significant secrets, what else might she have hidden? More importantly, who was the man in the letters? Whoever he was, he clearly held answers Daniel desperately needed. That night, as Daniel lay in bed staring at the ceiling, he realized there was only one path forward. To uncover the truth about his true father, he would have to dig deeper, even if it meant confronting things he wasn't ready to face. The next morning, Daniel woke up with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in days. The letters from the attic had given him a trail to follow, however faint it might be. Among the envelopes, one name stood out repeatedly: James Whitaker. Whoever this James was, he seemed central to Eleanor's secret past. Determined to uncover the truth, Daniel decided to trace his steps back to where the story began. His first stop was the local library. He spent hours poring over old newspapers and public records on microfilm, searching for any mention of James Whitaker. After what felt like an eternity, he finally found something, a small article about a man named James who had lived in a coastal town 2 hours away. According to the piece, James had worked as a fisherman before retiring due to health issues. The address listed matched the return address on the letters Daniel had found. With nothing but a name and an old address, Daniel drove to the coastal town. The journey gave him time to think, though his mind kept circling back to the same questions. Was James his biological father? Had Eleanor left him because of societal pressures or fear of scandal? And why had she never told Daniel the truth? By the time he arrived, the salty breeze and sound of crashing waves did little to calm his racing thoughts. The house at the address was smaller than he expected, its paint peeling and shutters hanging crookedly. A neighbor informed him that James had passed away nearly 15 years ago, leaving behind a widow and a daughter. Undeterred, Daniel knocked on their door. When it opened, an elderly woman greeted him cautiously. Her eyes softened when Daniel explained who he was and why he was there. She invited him in, offering tea while they talked. As they sat in her cozy living room, the widow, Margaret, shared bits and pieces of James's life. From her account, James had been a complicated man, charismatic yet troubled. Years ago, rumors swirled about an affair he'd had with a woman from another town. Though Margaret didn't know many details, she admitted James had returned home, guilt-ridden and distant, refusing to speak about what happened. "He carried that burden until the day he died," she said quietly, shaking her head. Margaret then introduced Daniel to her daughter Claire, who appeared to be in her late 40s. Claire listened intently as Daniel explained his reason for visiting. To his surprise, she pulled out an old photo album and flipped through its pages until she found what she was looking for. She pointed to a picture of James standing beside a young woman with strikingly familiar features. "This is the woman everyone whispered about," Claire said. Does she look familiar? Daniel's breath caught in his throat. It was unmistakable. The woman in the photograph bore a striking resemblance to Eleanor. His hands trembled as he studied the image, piecing together the fragments of the puzzle. James and Eleanor clearly had a connection deeper than friendship, but how far did it go? And could James truly be Daniel's father? Before leaving, Daniel thanked Margaret and Claire for their help. As he stepped outside, the weight of the revelations pressed heavily on him. James wasn't just some stranger. He was tied to Eleanor in ways Daniel couldn't yet fully comprehend. With each new clue, the mystery deepened, pulling him closer to answers he wasn't sure he was ready to face. Yet one thing was certain. The truth was waiting, buried somewhere in the past, and Daniel was determined to unearth it. Daniel left Margaret and Claire's house with a head full of questions and a heart heavy with uncertainty. The photograph of James and Eleanor together had shaken him more than he cared to admit. It wasn't just their smiles or the way they stood close to each other. It was the familiarity in their eyes, as if they shared something no one else could understand. For the first time, Daniel felt like he was staring at proof of a life his mother had deliberately kept hidden from him. Back at his car, Daniel sat for a moment, gripping the steering wheel tightly. He replayed the conversation with Margaret and Claire in his mind. Their words painted a picture of James as a man torn between love and duty, someone who made choices that haunted him for the rest of his life. But what about Eleanor? What role had she played in all of this? And most importantly, where did Daniel fit into the story? Determined to find out more, Daniel decided to visit the local library in the coastal town. If anyone knew anything about James Whitaker, or the rumors surrounding him, it would likely be documented somewhere. The librarian, an elderly woman named Ruth, greeted him warmly when he explained what he was looking for. She led him to a dusty corner filled with old newspapers, church bulletins, and community newsletters. As Daniel sifted through the materials, one name kept appearing alongside James's: Eleanor Grayson, the same maiden name his mother used before marriage. There were mentions of them attending events together years ago, though always described vaguely, as if people were trying not to draw too much attention. One particularly telling article caught Daniel's eye. It was a brief announcement about Eleanor leaving town suddenly for personal reasons. The timing matched perfectly with when Daniel would have been born. A chill ran down his spine as he realized the implications. Had Eleanor left because she was pregnant with James's child? Was that why she returned to her husband? To protect herself and her unborn baby from scandal? The idea was overwhelming, but it made sense in a way nothing else had so far. Feeling restless, Daniel drove around the town, hoping to stumble upon something, anything that might give him clarity. That's when he noticed a small cafe tucked away on a quiet street. On impulse, he went inside and struck up a conversation with the owner, an older man named Harold, who claimed to have lived in the area his entire life. When Daniel mentioned James Whitaker and Eleanor Grayson, Harold's expression changed. "Oh, I remember them," Harold said, leaning against the counter. "They caused quite the stir back in the day. Everyone knew they were involved. But Eleanor disappeared soon after, and James stopped talking about her altogether. Some folks thought she moved away because of family pressure. Others said—" He hesitated, glancing at Daniel cautiously. "Said what?" Daniel pressed, his voice barely above a whisper. Harold sighed. "Some said she left because she was carrying James's child." The room seemed to spin. Daniel gripped the edge of the counter to steady himself. Though he'd already suspected as much, hearing it aloud hit him like a punch to the gut. His whole life he'd believed he was the son of Eleanor and the man, in the photographs, the man everyone called his father. Now everything he thought he knew was crumbling. Before leaving the cafe, Harold handed Daniel a folded piece of paper. "This won't mean much to you," he said, "but it's an old address book I found while cleaning out my late wife's things. Your mother's name is in here along with some numbers and notes. Maybe it'll help." That night, as Daniel sat alone in his hotel room, he stared at the worn address book. Each scribbled entry felt like another thread pulling him deeper into the mystery of his origins. He couldn't ignore the growing suspicion that James Whittaker was indeed his biological father. But proving it, and understanding why Eleanor kept it a secret, was going to take more courage than he'd ever imagined. With each passing day, Daniel felt closer to the truth, even if it meant confronting painful realities about the woman he loved most. The next morning, Daniel woke up with a sense of urgency that pushed him out of bed before the sun had fully risen. The address book Harold had given him was clutched in his hand, its pages worn and brittle. He flipped through it again, scanning the entries for anything that might lead him closer to the truth. Among the names and numbers, one stood out, a contact labeled simply as Dr. L. Beside it was a phone number and a note. "E's doctor, trustworthy." Daniel's heart raced as he dialed the number, unsure of what to expect. After several rings, a gentle voice answered. "Hello?" "Hi," Daniel began hesitantly. "My name is Daniel Grayson. I'm trying to learn more about someone named Eleanor Grayson. She passed away recently, and I found your number in her belongings." There was a pause on the other end. "Eleanor," the voice repeated softly. It was a woman, her tone laced with nostalgia. "I haven't heard that name in years. How did you say you're connected to her?" "I'm her son," Daniel replied. Another pause, longer this time. When the woman spoke again, her voice carried a mix of sadness and curiosity. "Your mother was special, Daniel. We shared many conversations over the years, some happy, some difficult. If you'd like, we can meet. There are things you should know." They agreed to meet later that day at a small park near the edge of town. As Daniel waited on a bench by the lake, he watched families stroll by, children laughing and dogs bounding freely. The scene felt almost cruelly normal compared to the storm brewing inside him. When Dr. L arrived, a kind-eyed woman in her 60s, she greeted him warmly and sat beside him. "I worked with your mother during a challenging time in her life," Dr. L began, folding her hands in her lap. "She came to me when she was pregnant with you. She was scared, Daniel. Scared of judgment, scared of losing everything she held dear. At the time, society wasn't forgiving toward women who found themselves in complicated situations." Daniel listened intently, his throat tight. "Complicated situations?" he echoed. Dr. L nodded. "Eleanor loved two men, Daniel. One was your father, the man she married, and the other was James Whittaker. She didn't plan for any of it to happen, but love isn't always logical, is it? When she realized she was carrying James's child, she made a choice. To protect you. She returned to her husband and raised you as his son, hoping no one would ever find out." The words hit Daniel like a tidal wave. His mind flashed back to all the unanswered questions, the gaps in his childhood memories, the way Eleanor sometimes looked at him with an unspoken sorrow in her eyes. It all made sense now, or at least, it started to. But why keep it a secret? "From me?" Daniel asked, his voice trembling. "Why let me grow up believing something that wasn't true?" Dr. L sighed deeply. "Because she wanted to shield you from pain. She believed telling you the truth would only complicate your life, and maybe she hoped you'd never need to know." For a long moment, Daniel said nothing. He stared at the water rippling in the lake, feeling the weight of decades' worth of secrets pressing down on him. Yet, amidst the confusion and hurt, there was also clarity. His mother hadn't abandoned him or lied out of malice. She had done what she thought was best, even if it meant sacrificing her own happiness. Before leaving, Dr. L handed him a small envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter from Eleanor dated years ago. It was addressed to Daniel, though it seemed she had never intended to send it. The first line read, "To my dearest son, if you're reading this, I hope you'll forgive me." As Daniel read the letter, tears blurred his vision. In it, Eleanor confessed everything: the affair, the pregnancy, the decision to return to her husband. She wrote about her love for both men and how torn she had been. Most importantly, she expressed her unwavering love for Daniel, assuring him that he was the greatest joy of her life. By the time he finished reading, the sun was setting. casting golden light across the park. Daniel folded the letter carefully and tucked it into his pocket. For the first time in days, he felt a flicker of peace. The truth was painful, yes, but it was also freeing. Now he understood why his mother had whispered those 4 words to him in her final moments. She hadn't wanted him to carry her secrets alone anymore. The days that followed felt like a whirlwind of emotions for Daniel. Armed with the letter from Eleanor and the revelations from Dr. L, he finally had answers. But they came at a cost. His mind was a battlefield, torn between anger, sadness, and an overwhelming sense of betrayal. How could his mother have kept such a monumental truth hidden from him? And yet, as much as he wanted to be angry, he couldn't ignore the love and sacrifice that had driven her decisions. She had carried this burden alone for decades, shielding him from a truth she believed would hurt him. Still, Daniel knew there was one final step he needed to take before he could truly move forward. Confirming, beyond any doubt, that James Whitaker was his biological father. The thought of undergoing a DNA test had been lingering in the back of his mind since Margaret and Claire first mentioned James's name. Now, it felt inevitable. He reached out to a reputable testing service and submitted a sample using hair, strands he'd carefully collected from James's belongings during his visit to Margaret's house. It wasn't ideal, but it was all he had. Waiting for the results was agonizing. Every day stretched endlessly, each moment filled with restless anticipation. Daniel threw himself into work, trying to distract himself, but his thoughts always circled back to the same questions. What if the test confirmed James as his father? Would it change how he saw himself? How he viewed Eleanor? And what about the man he'd grown up calling Dad? The man who had raised him without ever knowing the truth? When the email finally arrived, Daniel hesitated before opening it. He sat on his couch, staring at the screen for what felt like hours. Finally, with trembling hands, he clicked the attachment. The report was clear and concise. James Whitaker was indeed his biological father. For a moment, Daniel simply stared at the words, unable to process them fully. A strange mix of relief and grief washed over him. Relief because he finally had undeniable proof of the truth. Grief because it meant everything he'd suspected was real. His life had been built on a foundation of secrets. But amidst those conflicting emotions, something else began to emerge. Acceptance. Over the next few days, Daniel revisited the memories he had of Eleanor. He thought about the sacrifices she had made, not just for him, but for everyone involved. She had chosen to protect her family, even if it meant living with guilt and regret. He remembered the way she used to hum while cooking dinner, the way she tucked him into bed every night, the way she always seemed to know when he needed encouragement or comfort. Those moments weren't lies. They were genuine expressions of her love. Daniel also found himself thinking about James. From what Margaret and Claire had told him, James had lived a life weighed down by remorse. Though he hadn't known Daniel existed, he had clearly struggled with the consequences of his choices. In a way, both of his parents had paid dearly for their mistakes. Slowly, Daniel began to forgive them, not because what they did was right, but because holding on to bitterness wouldn't change the past. Instead, he chose to focus on the lessons their stories taught him: the complexity of human relationships, the weight of sacrifice, and the enduring power of love, even in its most imperfect forms. One evening, Daniel returned to the park where he'd met Dr. L. He sat on the same bench watching the sun dip below the horizon. Pulling out Eleanor's letter, he read it again, letting her words sink deeper into his heart. For the first time, he spoke aloud, as though she could hear him. "I understand now, Mom. I don't know if I'll ever fully agree with what you did, but I see why you did it. And thank you for loving me enough to keep me safe." As darkness fell around him, Daniel felt a quiet resolve settle within him. The truth had been painful to uncover, but it had also given him clarity. He wasn't just the product of secrets and lies. He was the result of love, sacrifice, and resilience. With that realization, he stood up, ready to face whatever lay ahead. Not as the son of one father or another, but as Daniel Grayson, a man shaped by both his past and his future. With the truth finally laid bare, Daniel knew he couldn't leave things unresolved. Though James Whitaker was no longer alive, his legacy and the impact of his choices still lingered in the lives of those he'd left behind. Margaret and Claire had been kind enough to share their memories with him, but Daniel felt a deeper responsibility now. He wanted to understand not just who James was as his biological father, but also the man behind the rumors and regrets. Daniel returned to Margaret's house, this time with a bouquet of flowers and a heart full of gratitude. When she opened the door, her eyes softened at the sight of him. "You're back," she said simply, stepping aside to let him in. "I am," Daniel replied, handing her the flowers. "I wanted to thank you for everything you've shared. It means more than I can say." Margaret nodded, leading him to the same cozy living room where they'd first spoken. Claire joined them shortly after, carrying a tray of tea and biscuits. As they settled in, Daniel took a deep breath. "There's something I need to tell you both," he began. "The reason I came here wasn't just to learn about James, it was because I suspected he might be my father." Claire's eyes widened, while Margaret placed a hand over her mouth, her expression a mix of shock and understanding. "Oh, Daniel," she whispered, "that explains so much." He went on to explain everything: the letters, the DNA test, Eleanor's letter, and the weight of the secrets that had shaped his life. To his relief, neither Margaret nor Claire seemed upset by the revelation. Instead, they listened intently, their faces reflecting a mixture of sadness and empathy. James never spoke about it directly, Margaret admitted once Daniel finished speaking. But looking back, there were moments, times when he seemed lost in thought, staring off into the distance. "I always wondered if he regretted leaving someone behind, a family perhaps. Now I know," Claire chimed in, her voice gentle. "Dad wasn't perfect, Daniel. None of us are. But he loved deeply, even if he didn't always show it the right way. Knowing that he has a son, a good man like you, it gives me some peace. Maybe it'll give him peace too, wherever he is." Their words struck a chord in Daniel. For so long, he'd viewed James through the lens of betrayal and secrecy. But sitting there, surrounded by people who had loved him despite his flaws, Daniel saw a different side of the man who had unknowingly shaped his life. James wasn't just a name tied to scandal or regret. He was human, a person capable of love, mistakes, and redemption. Before leaving, Margaret handed Daniel a small wooden box. Inside were a few belongings that had belonged to James: a pocket watch, a faded photograph of him as a young man, and a journal filled with handwritten notes. "Take these," she urged. "They're yours now. Maybe they'll help you see him the way we did." That night, Daniel sat alone in his apartment, carefully examining the items from the box. The journal was particularly revealing, its pages brimming with reflections on life, love, and guilt. One entry stood out: "I've made mistakes I can't undo, but I hope someday someone will forgive me, not for my sake, but for theirs." Tears welled up in Daniel's eyes as he closed the journal. He realized then that forgiveness wasn't just about absolving others. It was also about freeing himself. By letting go of the anger and resentment he'd carried, he could honor both Eleanor and James, not for their imperfections, but for the love that had driven them, however flawed it may have been. The next day, Daniel visited Eleanor's grave. Standing before the headstone, he knelt down and placed the photograph of James beside a bouquet of fresh flowers. "This is where it ends, Mom," he said softly. "No more secrets. No more pain. I forgive you and him. We're all only human, aren't we?" As he walked away, the weight on his shoulders felt lighter than it had in weeks. The journey had been painful, but it had also taught him invaluable lessons about love, forgiveness, and the complexities of family. And though the scars of the past would always remain, Daniel knew he was ready to step into the future, not as a victim of circumstance but as someone stronger, wiser, and whole. The days that followed were transformative for Daniel. With the truth finally out in the open, he felt a renewed sense of purpose, not just to move forward with his life, but to honor the people who had shaped it, flaws and all. He began spending more time at the coastal town where James had lived, finding solace in its quiet charm. The ocean seemed to echo the ebb and flow of his emotions, offering a calming rhythm as he processed everything he'd uncovered. One morning, Daniel visited the beach where James had once worked as a fisherman. The salty breeze carried whispers of stories long past, and Daniel imagined what James's life must have been like, waking up before dawn, casting nets into the water, carrying the weight of both his livelihood and his secrets. As he walked along the shoreline, he noticed a small group of fishermen unloading their catch. One of them, an older man with weathered hands, waved him over. "You look like you're searching for something," the man said with a knowing smile. "I guess I am," Daniel admitted. "I'm trying to understand someone who used to live here, a man named James Whitaker." The fisherman chuckled softly. "Ah, James. Everyone knew him. He was quiet, kept to himself most days, but when he talked, you listened. You could tell he carried a lot inside him." Daniel nodded, struck by how consistent everyone's memories of James seemed to be. Though they painted him as a complicated man, there was always an undercurrent of respect and even affection in their words. It made Daniel realize that James hadn't been defined solely by his mistakes. He'd also been a person who inspired loyalty and care in those around him. As the weeks went by, Daniel found himself forming connections in the town. Margaret and Claire welcomed him warmly whenever he stopped by, sharing more stories about James and inviting him to family gatherings. Slowly, Daniel began to feel a sense of belonging, not as an outsider piecing together fragments of his past, but as someone embraced by a community that recognized his ties to one of their own. In his moments alone, Daniel reflected on the journey he'd taken. At first, he had sought answers out of confusion and pain, desperate to make sense of Eleanor's cryptic words. But now he saw that her final message wasn't meant to burden him. It was meant to set him free. By urging him to find his true father, she had given him the opportunity to confront the complexities of identity, love, and forgiveness. In doing so, she had allowed him to reclaim not just his origins but also his future. On his last visit to Eleanor's grave, Daniel brought 2 items: a photograph of James and a locket containing a picture of Eleanor. Placing them side by side, on the headstone he whispered, "Thank you, Mom, for loving me enough to keep me safe. And thank you, James, for being part of my story, even if we never met. I'll carry both of you with me, always." As he stood up, the sun broke through, the clouds casting golden light across the cemetery. For the first time in months, Daniel felt truly at peace. The scars of the past would always remain, but they no longer controlled him. Instead, they reminded him of the resilience of the human spirit, the ability to love deeply, stumble painfully, and rise again stronger than before. Back in his own town, Daniel returned to his routines, but with a newfound perspective. He reconnected with old friends, pursued hobbies he'd neglected, and even started volunteering at a local shelter. Each act felt like a step toward building a life rooted in gratitude and authenticity. He still thought about Eleanor and James, often, but their presence now felt comforting rather than haunting. The story didn't end with closure, it ended with growth. Daniel had uncovered painful truths, but in doing so, he had discovered something far greater: the power to forgive, to heal, and to embrace the fullness of who he was. As he stood on the balcony of his apartment one evening, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and pink, he smiled softly. His journey had been long and difficult, but it had led him exactly where he needed to be. Home. Not just to a place, but to himself.